a special pre-election edition of Lawmakers. Next.
Lawmakers is brought to you in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and through the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Lawmakers. I'm Mark McDonald. If you're familiar with our program, you know we're usually in the field and at the State House during legislative session. But since all of our legislators are out politicking and campaigning, we thought this would be a great time to bring you some insights about the election that's coming up in just over a week away. And we've got a wonderful panel for you here to give us those insights. I want to start just to my left with Mike Lawrence. Mike, I haven't seen you in a long time.
Yeah,
but
it has been a while.
But it's great to see you again. You're the former director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at
Right.
SIU Carbondale, Governor Edgar's press secretary, and a longtime journalist at the Sun-Times covering state issues. And you're still covering state issues. So it's great to have you back.
Thank you, Mark. It's good to be here.
Kent Redfield, retired Professor Emeritus, UIS, and still very active on the political scene. Thank you. Chris Moony, still working and teaching at UIS.
Only one here making a paycheck.
And, that's right. Well, it's great to have all three of you. And you know, we have I'm going to sort of outline for our audience what we're going to do here. We're going to take a look at the statewide races, of course, the governor's race and the U.S. Senate race. And then we're going to take a look at some of the House races, the U.S. House races that affect our viewing area. And then we're going to take a look at some of the state House races, which may or may not be in play. And there may be some sweeping changes at the state level, which we're going to find out about now. Okay, gentlemen, Quinn and Brady for governor. My question to you is, how in the world can this thing be so close when you have an incumbent Democrat governor and you've got an arch-conservative downstate Republican who doesn't hide this arch-conservativeness, and they're pretty much locked in an even in the polls? Mike, how can it be so close?
Well, I think there's a lot of unhappiness with the direction in which both the nation is going and the state is going. And so if you're an incumbent governor in Illinois, you're probably going to be in trouble by definition. Typically, a race where you have an incumbent is really a referendum on the incumbent. In this case, I think there are questions about Brady too. Brady won the primary without being well known statewide. He was well known downstate, but not in the Chicago metropolitan area. And Quinn has been trying to define Brady in a negative way ever since that primary. And the question is whether Brady has done any kind of a job of defining himself in a positive way.
Well, Kent, and that kind of, that's sort of my quandary with Quinn too, is when I think about him and I think about his governance and I think about his campaign, I don't know what his message is. Is that hurting him?
Well, no, I think it definitely, I mean, he needed to make a clean break from Governor Blagojevich. He needed to have people say, wow, this he's coming in, he's changing things, he's taking charge. And it's just seemed like a continuation of the same mess that we've been in. And so, yeah, in a normal year, all things being equal, a Democrat should win statewide. The Democratic base is bigger, and all you do is split the moderates and independents, and the Democrat wins. But all things are not equal. You know, the Democrats have made a terrible mess of the state budget, and nationally the Democrats can say, look what we inherited, look what the Republicans left us with. In Illinois, the Democrats can't blame anybody. And so, you know, all of it falls on an incumbent governor who isn't an incumbent. He has all of the bad things about being an incumbent and none of the upside. Normally you get to be governor for 4 years, you build up a record, you raise money, you build up obligations and stuff. And you know, Governor Quinn came in this terrible situation, And so he inherited a mess, but what's really hurt him is that people are not kind of saying, wow, this person's, he's a leader, he's turning things around. I don't know if anybody could have done that, but he's certainly suffering from that.
Chris, he comes in, yeah, he's on the defensive, and he wants a tax increase, which that's a tough combination, isn't it?
That's right. Well, you know, the budget situation in Illinois is just as bad as it can possibly be. And even though that doesn't necessarily translate to dissatisfaction with the voters, I think voters don't necessarily know how many $1 billion we are back, but they understand that there's some problems. And Quinn realizes that you either have, in order to solve a problem like this, you either have to raise taxes or cut spending. He doesn't want to cut spending. He's a good liberal. He doesn't want to, you know, that's more government rather than less. He's more programs that he'd like. The problem is that no other politician wants to, nobody in the legislature, for the most part, wants to get on board with the tax hike bandwagon in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression. So he's got a bad idea politically. He's got a campaign that's been a mess throughout, and as you know, the question you raised before about what his message was, well, the fact that you have to raise that question is indicative of the problems that they've been having. So yes, he's got some serious problems.
I think it's accurate to say that Governor Quinn has not been focused either governmentally or as a candidate. And there's a lot of frustration with that, particularly among his fellow Democrats.
Yeah, and Mike, that's a good point, because people who have supported him, and not just his fellow Democrats, but constituents who have gotten behind him, then hear him tell a different story when it actually comes down to backing up what he said he would do or where he would be on an issue. And we've seen this time and again where people say, I don't think they're calling him a flip-flopper, they're just calling him mushy. Kind of somebody who's not really standing up for what he said he would do. Yeah,
Pat Quinn made his mark as a populist. In that role, through the years, he could pick certain issues and take positions that were generally popular. People liked him. Maybe some of the insiders didn't like him, but citizens liked his position.
He shook it up, and they liked that, yeah.
When you're governor, you don't get to choose all your issues. They come to you, many of them, and it's how you handle that. And you're also in a position where you have to try to put things together. That takes a different kind of mindset and set of skills than being a populist and sort of lobbing the grenades into the State House from the outside.
Yeah, that's right. You need to be a good manager to be a governor, and Pat Quinn has shown that he's really not a very good manager. He as you suggest, he takes a position, he gives up on it, he can't organize a coalition, he does things, or he allows people underneath him to do things that embarrass him. He's got a sort of tin ear for some politics, for example, in the raising of the salaries for some of his insiders. I don't think that, frankly, from what I know of that situation, I don't think Pat Quinn said, let's give our staffers a raise. I think somebody else below him said, we ought to get a raise, let's work it out. And he didn't pay attention to what was going on and realize it was going to happen.
The chain of command was just not right on some of those issues, you know.
And on the other side, you know, Brady's message is much simpler. The state's in a mess, it's time for a change. Now, the specifics may not add up. It's not clear that what he's talking about from a budget standpoint really makes sense. It's also not clear that his positions on most social issues are probably not, you know, I said that poorly. It's clear that his positions on most social issues are not shared by the average person in Illinois, but that may not make any difference this time around, because you go through this litany of problems and the problems with the Quinn campaign, and it almost becomes, well, how come Brady isn't 40 points ahead? And it's because he's probably, you know, the worst candidate in terms of running statewide the Republicans could have picked, and so you can you can think of some other people who are running in the primary that probably would be 20 points ahead. But Brady has significant vulnerabilities that the Quinn people are trying to exploit, the result of which is the electorate is probably throwing up their hands at what has been, and it's increasingly nasty and campaign with not a lot of substance.
In their last debate, Quinn did try to lay some ethics issues on him, sale of property for his construction business. The fact is, I think, that what people are going to remember is that Brady brought it right back to the economy and to cutting spending. And I think that's what people are going to remember. That's his message. And sure. Like you say, it may not be doable, it may not be accurate, and the details may not be worked out yet, but people kind of understand where he is, and that's going to help him, I think.
That's more compelling. And I don't think in Illinois trying to say, the other guy is corrupt, elect me. Illinois voters believe all politicians in both parties are corrupt, and when we've gotten to this point after Governor Ryan and Governor Blagojevich, I don't think you get a lot of traction by, maybe a candidate that was completely devoid of, came from the outside, could talk about, not being part of the system, but everybody, voters just aren't buying it, and so corruption really isn't cutting it. It's much more competence, and people are unhappy, and it's time for change.
Before we leave this race, Chris, let me ask you, what do you think it will turn on? Now, let's say it's a toss-up right now. What do you think the election will turn on?
Well, it always comes down to who's going to come out to vote on Election Day, and what organization, especially in Chicago, if the Chicago organization get out people to vote, it'll be helpful for Quinn. If, on the other hand, the people that are energized and active are the people that are disaffected, the sort of Tea Party, and people who don't, maybe not Tea Party people, but that's the kind of feeling, they say things are bad, let's get something new, then that's probably the way it's going to go.
I think the short answer here is that it will turn out, which is really what Chris is saying.
The journalists versus the college.
and if we don't get heavy turnout in Chicago, or at least even an average turnout, I think Quinn's in trouble.
It'll be an early night at the Quinn campaign, huh?
It could be, yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the other big race, and we're still staying in the up in sort of in the Chicagoland area with the U.S. Senate race. We've got Alexei Giannoulias, the state senator, running against Congressman Mark Kirk. Again, the latest polls find these two pretty much neck to neck on this one, and it's kind of hard again, I think, to find the messages that these individuals bring to their campaign. Kent, what about Alexei Giannoulias? I mean, he doesn't have a great, an extensive track record. What does he bring?
No, I think that's true. I mean, this is a young person who basically has held one elective office, has had a career in banking, and the things that you would think would be his strength, his experience in the financial sector, the fact that he served 2 terms as a statewide official, those have turned out to be negatives. The family bank eventually went under. There are questions about who they were making loans to. There were some problems with the loan program, a college loan program within the state treasurer's office. There's not a lot that the state treasurer does. To say I was a great state treasurer, the public just doesn't know what that means. And so, I mean, he's young, attractive. He certainly, has ties to Obama. He's got a base in the Greek community, which, obviously helps in Chicago, which helps with finances. But, this is not a resume that you would think, that would be a strong candidate, and there certainly have been lots of problems in his campaign.
Now, go ahead, Mike.
Well, to use kind of a cliche, in my mind, Kirk has snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. I mean, he should be well ahead in this race, given the national trend and the baggage that Giannoulias had over some of the banking issues. But then he embellished his military record, And that's the kind of thing that will stick with people. And so it's a very tight race instead of what I thought could be a runaway.
They're about even in the polls, and they're about even in the amount of money they have in their campaign funds, Chris. Again, you know, we kind of look for a turning point. Is there something that's going to make this thing shift one way or the other?
Well, it seems unlikely that any new negativity is going to come out. So much of it's been out already. You know, neither one of them has anything more positive to say, probably, than they've already said. So now it's a ground game again. And I think the fact, to be frank, I think that that in particular Democrats are sort of best at, in general, at turnout in Chicago area. They've got this sort of organization up there and they can get people out. And since Quinn it's very important for the parties who wins the governor's office this year because of redistricting, which comes up next year. And if the Republicans can get I mean, it's unlikely the Republicans will take either the House or the Senate. That's possible, but it's not as nearly as likely as they can take the governor's mansion. So if they take the governor's mansion, they get a voice in the redistricting process, which is really all important for state politicians. Most people have no idea what I'm talking about, but it's really the main thing that matters to people in the State House in a decade. And so their best chances is at the governor's mansion. On the other hand, if the Democrats get it, then they can do whatever they want with redistricting, 100% theirs. And so I think both sides have incentive to do. One of the reasons we're seeing so much money being spent and so much advertising and you know, these sorts of things going on. So when things come, all it takes is 50% plus one, and or in the case of the governor's race, it may be less than that, since these other minor candidates are running as well. So you know, there's nobody's going to slack off for the next 2 weeks.
We mentioned that Alexei Giannoulias has a good relationship with Obama, and now in Illinois, in other states, that's not necessarily a positive thing. Do you think that's a positive thing?
Sure. Obama is more popular in Illinois than he is anywhere else. He's popular within the African American community, particularly in Chicago, which is where you need the energy. And so it's a bad thing for Democrats nationally that Obama has to campaign in Illinois, because you shouldn't be worrying about Illinois given its kind of political demographics. But it's good for Giannoulias to be here, and it's good for Democratic candidates to try and help build the turnout. You know, the Kirk Giannoulias is more kind of what's form in Illinois, kind of back to the all things being equal. You know, the Democratic base is in Chicago. Downstate is more Republican than ever, but it's losing people, and the battlegrounds in the suburbs, and it's about moderates and independents, and somewhat about Hispanic voters. We've had a huge increase in Hispanic voters over the last 2 decades. And so Kirk has a good profile, but you know, he's muddied it up with the character issues. He still is trying to kind of work between kind of Tea Party issues and conservative issues and moderate issues, and so we're back and forth on cap and trade. We're back and forth on immigration, and so you know, he's got some problems of kind of how to hold the base but go out and get the center. This looks more like kind of a normal statewide race, whereas the Quinn Brady is kind of upside down to a certain extent.
You know, but I would imagine that this thing with Kirk, he's going to be I mean, he looks like I mean, generally you think the statewide races are won in the close-in suburbs among basically women voters in the close-in suburbs. And he's a kind of a character, especially in a conservative Republican year, who could go for that. Or that voter would be attractive to, because he's relatively moderate and he's from around that area. Whereas Brady, on the other hand, is a little more scary to them. And so it's quite possible, I mean, given his conservatism and his facts from downstate, so I wouldn't be actually surprised if Kirk wins and Brady loses.
I'll be darned, wouldn't it?
It'd be unlikely. I mean, usually they're going to go, I mean, you expect them to go the same way, but.
Okay, let's leave that and go to the 17th U.S. House District. This is interesting because Phil Hare's district, the present congressman from there, He goes from the Quad Cities, and he comes down and he takes in a sliver, a little bit of Quincy, and he comes a little bit of Springfield, a little bit of Decatur. He's got a really weird-looking district.
It's the most egregious case of incumbent protection gerrymandering in the country. Can't say that for very much longer. But,
well, you know, that's been a Democratic seat for 20 years. And the latest poll out now shows that Bobby Schilling is ahead of him 45 to 38%. This is a Hill poll, and he's got to be scratching his head thinking, wait a minute, we own this seat, but it looks like it could turn.
Well, I think it's a reflection of the national trend. That should be a Democrat seat by the numbers, but against this building Republican tide, it's in jeopardy. And unless somehow the polls are wrong, and they'd have to be far off, it will be, again, generally a Republican year. And I think Hare recognizes he's in a battle to try to beat the tide.
Yeah, it is. The fact that the district is really incoherent. I mean, you know, it's a block wide as it goes through Springfield over to Decatur, means that, you know, it isn't like you're representing a community or a neighborhood or even a group of counties that kind of hang together. And so, you know, it was Lane Evans's seat. It was drawn for Lane Evans, and he had a very nonpartisan kind of an appeal in terms of veterans and the issues that he stressed. And, you know, Hare is not a very good candidate. I think that's pretty clear, that he is not a polished person in terms of a speaker. He doesn't think well on his feet. And this is one of those, you know, all things being equal, it should be a Democratic seat. But if you've got a Republican trend, and then you've got somebody who, when you get in a close race, gets exposed as not being a very effective candidate, then, you know, that can be deadly. Now, he may still win, and there's another poll out there that shows it, you know, within the margin of error. But again, this shouldn't be happening. This was drawn to re-elect a Democrat. But a Republican year and somebody and not a very good candidate, then you know, that you know, the voters, no one's going to run through a wall for Congressman Hare. He just doesn't generate that kind of wild enthusiasm.
Bobby Schilling is a self-described Tea Party member. And it looks like that's really all he needs to be right now.
Why not? Yeah, everybody get on board. You know, you got to remember where Phil Hare comes from, too. Phil Hare is the kind of congressman who is a creature of Washington by and large. I mean, he was Lane Evans' chief of staff or some, and that's a very common thing to happen. People who work on the staff in D.C., they work with constituents, and then they sometimes they make pretty good candidates, but they're mostly inside people. They didn't go out on the hustings and take this. In fact, the way that he got that seat in the first place, as I recall, is that Evans won the primary and then decided to quit, and so that was sort of, he was appointed to the can. It was, so, you could name half a dozen congressmen have gotten there that way in Illinois in the last decade, but you know, that when, like Ken said, when you have to stand on your own 2 feet and go, if you don't have those skills, you could be in trouble.
Again, I think it will come to turnout, or could come to turnout, and Congressman Hare does have a strong relationship with organized labor, and the unions have a lot at stake, not only in this district, but nationally. And so if they're able to mobilize to actually get their members and others out to vote, it could contribute or result in a different picture on election day than we're seeing right now in the polls.
And we, you know, we're going to have a lot of competitive downstate districts in the legislature, and I think it's clear that that benefits, you know, Brady and Kirk, It's not all that clear who that benefits in the congressional race because it's so hard to figure out how that congressional district fits into those downstate legislative districts that are being be competitive. But the fact that we're going to have some really expensive competitive downstate districts probably is going to benefit the Republicans in terms of turnout, because even people that come out and vote for Deanna DiMuzio for the state Senate are probably, you know, a lot of those are then going to turn around and vote for Bill Brady and for Mark Kirk.
I'm glad you led us there, because in the few minutes we have left, I want to talk about the State House just a little bit. Now, House Speaker Madigan has $3 million more to spend than his Republican counterpart, and that's just about the same amount that the Democratic Senate leader has to spend as well, more than his counterpart. Do you see, given that amount of money that they have to spend, that there's any chance that there could be a power shift in either the state Senate or the State House?
The Senate is impossible because for it to change. There's only a third of the Senate is up. There's just not that many targets of opportunity. It's a 37-22 majority for the Democrats, and there just aren't that many competitive seats. I could see the Republicans picking up 3 or 4 seats, but that would only, you know, that would get them from 22 to 26. On the House, you never say never. It's 12 seats. But 70 to 48. But there are probably a dozen or more seats in play, and you know, I could see the Republicans picking up 6 to 8 seats. I'm not sure they can get to 12, but boy, you get an election night like 1994, and anything's possible.
Chris, do you think that this sort of Republican wave that's sweeping over, will it touch the State House, you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, whenever most people, when they go to vote, they primarily are not focused on their state rep and even the governor. Oftentimes, they're thinking in general about how things are in the country, and by and large, if the economy is bad, that's the #1 thing they're worried about. And so, the people who will be energized will be the people who are not happy. People are not going to be, you know, Democrats are going to be less excited. Republicans are more excited because the Republicans have got Sarah Palin. They're out there yelling, you know, things are looking bad. And so the Republicans will have the energy. They will turn out more. And, you know, and then when they go in there to vote for whatever Republican at the top of the ticket, they're might as well vote for this Republican too, or this guy I never heard of who's an incumbent, or not the incumbent.
It's a much, if you look at the 49th Senate District, which is Deanna DiMuzio, whose husband was the representative district for a long, then, you know, that's a district leans Republican, but you've got a strong Democratic name. You can overcome the tide, and whereas you get to the 98th district, which is part of that, which is Gary Hanning's old seat, now that's an open seat. That's, you know, in this kind of an election where you've got people locally have been voting Republican for governor and for president for a long time, all of a sudden that familiar Democratic name isn't there anymore, and that becomes a very difficult task for the Democrats to hold that seat. So, you know, that's part of the dynamic that's going on.
And there's largely, you know, there's oftentimes in that last week, that last flurry of electioneering that you see, a lot of times people pay no attention to those ads. They've just had it. They just, you know, they're going to do something else.
You know,
Anybody who watches the news at night is one commercial after another. The first one's saying something about candidate A, telling that candidate B is bad, and the next one's candidate B saying how bad candidate A is, and you don't know what they're running for or who they are. You just pox on all their houses. And they're terrible. Most of them are terrible commercials, so that it's like come jarring onto your TV. What the heck? Who's that ugly person there?
Well, gentlemen, it's not us, I can tell you.
Of course.
We've got to get going. I want to thank all 3 of you for coming in. This has been very enlightening for me, and I think it has been for our audience, too. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
you're welcome.
And thank you all for joining us on Lawmakers. See you next time.
Lawmakers is brought to you in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and through the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.